The ring sat alone on the breakfast table, catching the early light, and Nathaniel Ashworth stopped walking the moment he saw it. He had come down the same way he always did, footsteps even, jacket buttoned, mind already halfway into the accounts he planned to review before noon. He had not expected to stop. He had not expected his chest to tighten at the sight of a small gold band resting beside an empty plate. Eleanor's chair was empty too. For a moment he told himself she had simply gone upstairs, forgotten something, would return any second with that quiet smile she gave him every morning, the one he had stopped truly looking at months ago. He waited. The clock on the wall ticked. She did not come. He walked closer to the table and saw the folded piece of paper beneath the ring. His hand hesitated over it the way a hand hesitates over a door it is not sure it wants to open. Then he picked it up. The paper was plain, no decoration, just her handwriting, small and neat, the same handwriting that used to fill birthday cards and quick notes left on his desk in the early years of their marriage, notes he had stopped reading closely somewhere along the way. The words were short. "Ask Lucy what I couldn't tell you." He read it twice, then a third time, waiting for more meaning to surface, waiting for the sentence to explain itself. It did not. 6 words, and beneath them, nothing else. No goodbye, no explanation, no accusation even, which somehow made it worse, because an accusation would have given him something to argue against. He turned the paper over. Blank. He looked at the ring again. It was not thrown, not dropped in anger. It had been placed, carefully, deliberately, the way Eleanor placed everything, the way she had arranged flowers in the hall every Sunday for 6 years, the way she had folded his shirts when they were newly married, and still learning each other's habits. This was not a woman storming out. This was a woman who had planned this morning down to the last detail, and that thought frightened him more than any dramatic exit could have. He called for her. His voice sounded strange in the quiet house, too loud, too raw. No answer came. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, pushed open the door to her room, and found the wardrobe half open, a few dresses missing, her small travel case gone from its usual place beside the window. She had left, not fled in panic, not disappeared without a trace. She had packed, calmly, and walked out of a house she had lived in for 6 years, leaving behind only a note that pointed him toward someone else's mouth, for the truth she would not say herself. He sat down on the edge of the bed, the note still in his hand, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Nathaniel Ashworth did not know what to do next. He thought of the last few months, trying to find the crack he must have missed. Eleanor had been quieter lately, yes, but he had told himself it was simply her nature, the calm and steady woman he had married, never one for loud feelings or dramatic scenes. She smiled at breakfast. She asked about his day. She sat across from him at dinner and spoke of small things, the garden, a letter from her sister, the weather turning colder. Had she been unhappy the whole time, and he had simply not noticed, too comfortable in the shape of their routine to look closely at the woman living inside it? He thought back further, to the early years, when things had felt different, warmer somehow, though he struggled now to remember exactly what had changed or when. There had been a slow drift, the kind that happens without a single dramatic moment to mark it, days folding into other days, until one morning you wake up and realize the person beside you has become a stranger wearing a familiar face. He stood, folded the note carefully, and put it in his coat pocket. Whatever answers existed, they did not exist in this room. He needed to speak with Lucy. He found her in the kitchen, already at work despite the early hour. Her sleeves rolled to the elbow as she moved between the stove and the counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who had run this household for years. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression shifted the moment she saw his face. "Your Grace," she said carefully, setting down the cloth in her hands. "Where is Eleanor?" he asked, skipping any pretense of composure. Lucy's eyes moved briefly to the note visible at the edge of his coat pocket, and he understood then that she already knew what had happened, had perhaps known before he came down that morning at all. "I think you should sit down," she said. "I don't want to sit down," he said. "I want to know where my wife has gone, and I want to know what she meant when she wrote that I should ask you what she couldn't tell me herself." Lucy studied him for a long moment, the kind of look a person gives when they are deciding whether someone deserves the truth or only deserves to be protected from it. Whatever she saw in his face seemed to convince her, because she finally nodded and gestured toward the small table in the corner of the kitchen, the one where the staff took their meals. "Sit," she said again, gentler this time. "Please." He sat. She poured him tea he did not ask for and did not want, a habit of comfort more than necessity, and took the seat across from him, folding her hands together the way a person does when they are about to say something difficult. Her ladyship has not been well, Lucy began. Not well for some time now. Nathaniel felt something cold move through his chest. Not well how? Is she ill? I don't know the details, Lucy said. She never told me everything. She only asked me to keep certain things quiet, and I did, because she asked me to, and because it was not my place to say otherwise. What things? He pressed. Lucy, please. She has visited Dr. Hume more than once this past year, Lucy said. Always in the mornings, always when you were occupied with the estate business. She never mentioned it to you. Nathaniel sat back in his chair as though the words had physically pushed him. 6 years married to this woman, and he had not known she was seeing a physician regularly, had not noticed the pattern of mornings she must have spent away from the house. Why wouldn't she tell me? He asked. Though even as the words left his mouth he suspected he already knew the shape of the answer, even if he did not want to hear it spoken aloud. Lucy hesitated. This is not really something for me to explain, Your Grace. I think that is exactly why she left the note the way she did. She wanted you to ask the questions yourself, and to keep asking them, rather than simply being told an answer you could set aside and forget by evening. He felt the sting of that observation even though Lucy had not meant it unkindly. It was, perhaps, exactly what he might have done, listened to an explanation, nodded gravely, and returned to his ledgers an hour later, believing the matter settled because he had heard it once. Was she in pain? He asked quietly. Is she in pain now? I don't know, Lucy admitted. She kept a great deal to herself, Your Grace, more than she should have needed to, if I may say so. What do you mean by that? Lucy's expression grew careful again, weighing her words. I mean that a wife should not need to keep her own suffering a secret from her husband. I mean that in 6 years, I have rarely seen the two of you sit together in a room with nothing to do but simply talk. I have seen you sit across from each other at dinner, yes, and exchange pleasant words about pleasant things. But I have not seen you ask her how she truly is, not in a way that made her believe you wanted the real answer. The words landed with more force than Lucy likely intended, and Nathaniel found he had no immediate defense against them, because some quiet part of him recognized the truth in what she said. He thought of all the mornings at this very table, Eleanor across from him, both of them polite, both of them careful, neither of them saying anything that mattered. He had believed, foolishly perhaps, that peace and comfort were the same thing as closeness. He was beginning to understand they were not. Where has she gone? He asked again, quieter now, some of the urgency drained out of his voice and replaced with something closer to fear. I don't know for certain, Lucy said, but if I were guessing, I would guess she has gone to be somewhere she feels safe, somewhere that is entirely her own, somewhere she does not have to arrange her face into a particular expression before she walks through a door. Do you have any idea where that might be? He asked. Lucy shook her head slowly. That is something you would know better than I would, Your Grace, if you think hard enough about the years you have shared with her. I imagine there are places she has spoken of, even briefly, places that meant something to her before she became a duchess and had to learn to hide half of what she felt. Nathaniel closed his eyes and tried to remember. Eleanor speaking of her childhood, a cottage somewhere near the coast that belonged to her family before her father's fortunes changed, a place she visited as a girl and had once described, in an unguarded moment early in their marriage, as the only place she had ever felt completely free. He had forgotten about it entirely until this moment, filed away somewhere in his memory alongside 100 other small things she had told him that he had not thought important enough to hold on to. He opened his eyes and looked at Lucy. There is a place. I think I remember a place. Then perhaps that is where you should begin looking, Lucy said. Though I would also say this, Your Grace, and forgive me for speaking plainly. Finding her will not be the difficult part. The difficult part will be showing her that something has actually changed in you, and not simply that you are frightened of losing her. He absorbed the warning, understanding even as she said it that Lucy was right to give it. It would be easy to ride out in search of Eleanor, driven by panic and guilt, and arrive at whatever door she was hiding behind with nothing more to offer than desperation. That was not what she needed. He suspected, though he could not yet fully explain why, that desperation was not what had been missing from their marriage. Attention was. Real, sustained, patient attention. The kind he had stopped giving somewhere along the way, without ever deciding to stop. He needed to understand more before he went anywhere. He needed to understand what Eleanor had been carrying alone, and why she had believed, rightly or wrongly, that she could not bring it to him. Thank you, Lucy, he said finally, standing from the table. Your Grace, Lucy said, before he could leave the kitchen. May I say one more thing? Go ahead. She loves you. I have watched her long enough to know that much is true. But love does not stop a person from feeling invisible, and I think that is closer to what happened here than anything else. Nathaniel nodded slowly, the words settling into him with a weight he suspected would take a long time to fully carry. He left the kitchen and walked back through the quiet halls of a house that suddenly felt far too large and far too empty, carrying with him a note he could not yet understand, and a warning he intended to take seriously. He needed to speak to Charles next. If anyone else in this household had noticed what he had missed, it would be his estate manager, a man who saw more of the daily rhythms of the house than Nathaniel ever allowed himself time to notice. But first, he stood for a long moment in the hallway outside Eleanor's empty room and allowed himself, for perhaps the first time since reading her note, to feel the full weight of how much he did not know about the woman he had married. Charles Bennett had managed the Ashworth estate for nearly a decade, and in that time he had learned to read Nathaniel's moods the way a farmer reads weather, small signs that told him what kind of day was coming before a single word was spoken. When Nathaniel entered the study that morning, Charles looked up from the ledgers spread across the desk and set down his pen immediately. "Something has happened," Charles said. It was not a question. "Eleanor is gone," Nathaniel said, and watched Charles's face carefully as he said it, searching for any flicker of surprise. There was none, only a slow, careful stillness, the kind of stillness a man wears when he already knows something and is deciding how much of it he is permitted to share. "You knew," Nathaniel said. "You knew this was coming." Charles was quiet for a moment. "I suspected something was troubling her," he admitted finally. "I did not know she intended to leave." "Tell me what you suspected." "Your Grace," Charles said carefully, "this is a conversation better suited to husband and wife, not to a man who manages your accounts." "My wife is not here to have that conversation," Nathaniel said, sharper than he intended. "She left a note telling me to ask questions, Charles, and I intend to ask every single person in this house until I understand what I missed." Charles studied him for a long moment, then rose from behind the desk and closed the study door. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, more careful. "She came to me some months ago," he said. "She wanted to know about the trust her father had left her, whether it was still separate from the estate accounts, whether she would have access to funds that were entirely her own if she ever needed them." Nathaniel felt his stomach drop. "She was planning to leave even then." "I don't believe that was her intention at the time," Charles said. "I believe she wanted to know she had options. There is a difference, Your Grace, between a woman making a plan to leave and a woman simply wanting to know that she is not entirely without power in her own life." "Why would she feel she had no power? She is the Duchess of this house." Charles's expression grew careful again, the look of a man choosing his next words with great precision. "Titles are not the same as freedom, Your Grace. A woman can hold a grand title and still feel she has no say in the small decisions of her own days. I do not say this to accuse you of anything. I say it because I have watched this household for 10 years, and I have seen the pattern of it." "What pattern?" Nathaniel asked, though something in him already dreaded the answer. "You make the decisions," Charles said simply. "All of them. What events the household attends, how the money is spent, which guests are received, even, I think, small things like which rooms are redecorated and when. Her ladyship is consulted, but I have rarely seen her opinion actually change the outcome of anything." Nathaniel opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, because he could not immediately think of an example that disproved what Charles had said. He tried to remember the last time Eleanor had wanted something different from what he wanted, and he had simply agreed to her preference instead of his own. He could not think of one. "That is not the same as unkindness," Charles added gently, as though sensing the direction of Nathaniel's thoughts. "I do not believe you have ever been cruel to her. But there is a kind of loneliness that comes from never being truly needed for your own judgment, only for your presence and your agreement. I believe that loneliness can wear a person down as surely as any harsh word." Nathaniel sat down heavily in the chair across from the desk, the fight gone out of him. He thought of every dinner conversation where Eleanor had offered a soft opinion, and he had, without realizing it, steered the conversation back toward his own preference, believing all the while that he was simply being decisive, being the kind of steady husband the household needed. He had never once considered that his steadiness might have felt, to her, like a wall. "There is something else," Charles said, his voice quieter now. "Tell me. She asked me once, several weeks ago, whether I thought a person could love someone and still feel completely alone with them. I did not know how to answer her. I have thought about that question many times since." Nathaniel felt the words settle into his chest like stones. He understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, that Eleanor had been asking that question about her own marriage, and that she had asked it to his estate manager, because she had not felt she could ask it to him. Did you tell her anything? He asked. I told her that I believed it was possible, Charles said, and that I believed the loneliness she was describing was not always caused by a lack of love. Sometimes it is caused by a lack of attention. Love can exist quite fully in a person's heart and still fail to reach the person standing right in front of them, simply because it is never properly shown. Nathaniel put his head in his hands for a moment, the weight of the morning finally catching up to him fully. He had come into this study looking for information, for a location, for something practical he could act on immediately. Instead, he was receiving something far harder to hold, a slow and painful accounting of everything he had failed to notice in his own marriage. I need to find her, he said finally, lifting his head. Charles, I think I know where she is gone. There was a cottage, near the coast, that belonged to her family before her father lost his fortune. She spoke of it once, years ago, as the only place she ever felt completely herself. Charles nodded slowly. Then I would go there. But Your Grace, if I may offer one piece of advice before you leave this room. Go ahead. Do not go to convince her to come home. Go to listen. If you arrive with arguments already prepared, ready to explain why she is wrong to have left, you will only prove to her that nothing has changed. She does not need a husband who can defend himself well. She needs a husband who can finally hear her. The words struck something deep in Nathaniel, and he found himself nodding, though he was not entirely certain he knew how to do what Charles was describing. He had spent his entire life being trained to argue well, to defend positions, to win rooms full of men who disagreed with him. He was not certain he knew how to simply sit and listen without immediately searching for the counterpoint. He was still sitting with that thought when the study door opened without a knock, and Margaret Colby swept into the room with the particular fury of an older sister who has just learned something devastating about someone she loves. Where is she? Margaret demanded, not bothering with any greeting at all. Where is my sister, Nathaniel, and what did you do to make her leave her own home before sunrise with nothing but a travel case? I don't know exactly where she is, Nathaniel said, standing to face her. But I believe I know where she might have gone. Margaret's eyes narrowed, sharp and assessing, the look of a woman who had spent her entire life protecting her younger sister and had no intention of stopping now. You believe. You believe after 6 years of marriage. You only believe where your own wife has gone to escape you. That is not entirely fair, Nathaniel started, but Margaret cut him off before he could finish. Not fair, she repeated, her voice rising. Let me tell you what is not fair, Nathaniel. It is not fair that my sister spent the last year of her life quietly frightened and in pain, and told no one in this house the full truth of it, because she did not believe you would treat her as anything other than something fragile to be managed. It is not fair that she asked you, more than once, simply to sit with her in the evenings instead of retreating to this study with your ledgers, and you told her you were too occupied with estate matters. It is not fair that a woman can be married to a duke and still feel more alone than she did before she ever wore his ring. Nathaniel felt each accusation land like a physical blow, made worse by the fact that he could not honestly deny a single one of them. He remembered now, with sudden and painful clarity, evenings when Eleanor had asked quietly if he might join her by the fire instead of working, and he had promised to come in just a moment, and the moment had stretched into an hour, and by the time he finally emerged from the study she had already gone up to bed alone. He had never once considered those small refusals as anything significant. They had felt, at the time, like reasonable priorities, the ordinary business of running a large estate. He was beginning to understand that to Eleanor, each one might have felt like a small confirmation that she came second to everything else in his life. You're right, he said quietly, and watched Margaret's expression shift slightly with surprise, as though she had expected him to argue. I know I'm right, she said, though with less heat now. I have known it for months, Nathaniel, and I said nothing because it was not my place to interfere in your marriage. I regret that now. I should have said something sooner. Where do you think she's gone? He asked. Margaret hesitated, and Nathaniel could see her weighing whether to trust him with the answer. Finally she sighed, some of the fight draining from her shoulders. The cottage, she said. Our family's old cottage by the coast. She always said it was the only place that ever felt entirely hers. That confirms what Charles and I had guessed, he said. Margaret studied him for a long moment. If you go there, Nathaniel, you had better be prepared to actually change, not simply apologize and expect that to be enough. Eleanor does not need pretty words. She has heard pretty words from you for 6 years. She needs to see something different in how you actually treat her, starting from the very first moment you find her. I understand, he said. I hope you do, Margaret said, because if you go there and say all the right things and then return to exactly the man you were before, you will lose her permanently, and I will not forgive you for it either. She left the study without another word, and Nathaniel stood alone amid the quiet of the room, surrounded by ledgers and papers that suddenly felt entirely unimportant. He thought of Eleanor at the coast, alone in a small cottage, carrying whatever burden Dr. Hume knew the full details of, a burden she had chosen to carry by herself rather than bring to him. He needed to understand that burden before he went anywhere. He needed to speak with Dr. Hume, and he needed to do it today, because every hour that passed felt like another hour Eleanor spent believing she had been right to leave without telling him the whole truth. He called for his horse to be readied, then changed his mind and called instead for the carriage, remembering that whatever news awaited him at Dr. Hume's office might not be news he could absorb while managing the reins of a horse. He needed his full attention for whatever came next, and some instinct told him the hardest part of this day had not yet arrived. Dr. Alistair Hume's office sat on a quiet street near the edge of town, a modest building with a brass plate beside the door, and Nathaniel had passed it 100 times in his life, without ever once considering what might be happening behind its windows. He climbed out of the carriage before it had fully stopped and walked inside without waiting to be announced. The doctor looked up from his desk, startled, then rose quickly when he recognized his visitor. "Your Grace," he said, "I wasn't expecting you." "I need to speak with you about my wife," Nathaniel said, closing the office door behind him. "I know she has been coming to see you. I need to know why." Dr. Hume's expression grew careful, the particular caution of a man bound by a promise he had made to a patient. "Your Grace, I have great respect for you, but what passes between myself and a patient is not something I can simply share because you ask it of me." "She is gone," Nathaniel said. "She left our home this morning with nothing but a travel case and a note telling me to seek answers I clearly should have already had. I am not asking you to break a confidence out of idle curiosity, Doctor. I am asking because I believe her life may depend on someone finally telling me the truth." Dr. Hume studied him for a long moment, weighing something behind his careful eyes. Finally, he gestured to the chair across from his desk, and Nathaniel sat, his hands gripping the armrests as though bracing for a blow. "Sit down," Dr. Hume said again, unnecessarily, since Nathaniel had already done so. "I will tell you what I believe I am permitted to tell you, though I want to be clear that some of this should come from her, not from me." "Please," Nathaniel said, "whatever you can share." Dr. Hume folded his hands on the desk. "Your wife came to me first nearly a year ago, complaining of fatigue and occasional pain she could not fully explain. I ran a number of tests over the following months. What I found was a condition of the heart, Your Grace, one that requires careful management, rest, and a controlled life free of excessive strain." Nathaniel felt the floor seem to tilt slightly beneath him. "Is it dangerous? Is her life in danger?" "It can be managed," Dr. Hume said carefully. "With proper care, many people live full lives with this condition. But it is serious, and it requires vigilance, and yes, if left unmanaged or if she is placed under significant emotional or physical strain, it can become dangerous." "Why didn't she tell me?" Nathaniel asked, though even as he said it he suspected he already understood at least part of the answer. Dr. Hume was quiet for a moment. "I asked her that very question myself, more than once. She gave me a similar answer each time. She said she was afraid of how you would treat her once you knew." "Afraid of me," Nathaniel repeated, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "I would never hurt her." "Not afraid of unkindness," Dr. Hume clarified, "afraid of a different kind of harm. She feared you would become so consumed with protecting her, so focused on her condition, that you would stop seeing her as a wife and begin seeing her only as something fragile to be managed. She used almost those exact words, Your Grace, if I recall correctly. She said she did not want to become a patient in her own marriage before she had ever truly felt like a partner in it." Nathaniel sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling slowly through him. He thought of his own instincts, how his immediate reaction to hearing about her condition was a rush of protective urgency, a desire to wrap her in careful attention and remove every possible strain from her life. He understood, with sudden discomfort, that this exact instinct was precisely what Eleanor had feared. "She did not want to be protected," he said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke it. "She wanted to be understood." Dr. Hume nodded. "I believe that is precisely correct. There is a difference, Your Grace, between a husband who wraps his wife in careful distance out of fear for her health, and a husband who remains fully present with her, who continues to see her as a full person with thoughts and desires and frustrations of her own, simply one who also happens to require some additional care. Most people who love someone with a serious condition fall into the first pattern without ever meaning to. It comes from love, but it does not always feel like love to the person receiving it." "How long has she known?" Nathaniel asked. Nearly a year, Dr. Hume said. I confirmed the diagnosis fully about 8 months ago. 8 months, Nathaniel repeated, doing the arithmetic in his mind, counting back through evenings and mornings and quiet dinners where Eleanor had sat across from him carrying this knowledge entirely alone, smiling when the situation called for smiling, asking about his day, never once letting the weight of what she knew show on her face. He felt something close to shame at how easily she had managed to hide it from him, and then, close behind the shame, a colder and more uncomfortable thought. Perhaps it had not been difficult for her to hide it. Perhaps he had simply not been looking closely enough to notice. Is there anything specific I should know? He asked. For her care, I mean, going forward. Dr. Hume outlined the details carefully, the medications she would need, the activities that should be limited, the warning signs that would require immediate attention, and Nathaniel listened to all of it with the same focus he usually reserved for matters of the estate, understanding somewhere in the back of his mind that this was, in fact, the most important account he had ever been asked to manage. There is one more thing, Dr. Hume said, as Nathaniel prepared to leave, something she said to me during her last visit, only a few weeks ago. What did she say? She told me she intended to tell you the full truth soon. She said she was tired of carrying it alone, tired of the distance it had created between the two of you, even though you did not fully understand why that distance existed. She said she was afraid, but that she had decided the fear of telling you was smaller than the fear of continuing to hide it. Then why did she leave instead? Nathaniel asked, more to himself than to the doctor. Dr. Hume considered the question carefully. I cannot say for certain, but if I were to guess, I would say that perhaps something happened, some moment, however small, that convinced her the conversation she had planned would not go the way she hoped. Perhaps she lost her courage, or perhaps she simply reached a point where she needed to know, before telling you anything at all, whether you were the kind of husband who would come looking for the truth on your own, without needing to be told directly. The observation struck Nathaniel with unexpected force. He thought again of the note, 6 words with no explanation, a test disguised as a mystery. Eleanor had not simply run away, she had left behind a door, and the note was an invitation to walk through it, to prove through his own effort and attention that he was capable of finding his way to understanding, without being led there by the hand. I need to go to her, he said, rising from the chair. Dr. Hume nodded. I would suggest you do, Your Grace, and when you find her, I would suggest you listen more than you speak. She has spent a great deal of time recently feeling unheard. That is a wound that requires patience to heal, not grand gestures. Nathaniel thanked the doctor and left the office, standing for a moment on the quiet street outside, the midday sun bright and indifferent above him. He thought of Eleanor at the coast, alone, carrying a fear about her own heart that she had not felt safe enough to share with the man who had promised, 6 years ago, to share every burden of her life alongside his own. He climbed back into the carriage and gave the driver instructions to prepare for a longer journey, toward the coast, toward the cottage Margaret and Charles had both pointed him toward a conversation he was not entirely certain he knew how to have, but understood, with complete clarity now, that he could not afford to fail. As the carriage pulled away from the doctor's office, Nathaniel found himself thinking not of arguments to prepare or explanations to offer, but simply of Eleanor's face, the particular way she smiled when she believed no one was truly looking at her closely, a smile he now suspected had been covering far more than he had ever allowed himself to notice. He thought of the ring still resting in his coat pocket, the one she had placed so carefully on the breakfast table, and he understood, finally, that she had not left it behind as a symbol of ending things between them. She had left it behind because she needed, more than anything else, to know whether he would come looking for the woman who wore it, and not simply for the title she carried or the peace her presence maintained in his household. He intended to prove, however long it took, that he would. The journey to the coast would take the better part of 2 days, and Nathaniel spent the first hours of it staring out the carriage window without truly seeing the countryside passing by. His mind kept circling back to the same handful of moments, turning them over like stones, searching for the exact point where he had stopped paying attention closely enough to notice his own wife slipping away from him. He thought of their wedding day, 6 years ago now, Eleanor in a pale blue dress standing beside her father in the small chapel near her family home, her eyes bright with something that had looked, at the time, like pure and uncomplicated happiness. He had believed in that moment that he understood exactly what kind of husband he intended to be. Steady, reliable, a man who provided for his family and managed his estate with careful diligence, who never raised his voice, who never gave his wife any cause for worry. He had not understood, back then, that steadiness without presence could feel, over time, like its own kind of absence. The carriage rattled over a rough patch of road, jolting him from his thoughts, and he found himself remembering a specific evening, perhaps 2 years into their marriage, when Eleanor had come into his study, carrying a small book of poetry, asking shyly if he might read a few pages aloud with her by the fire, the way they sometimes had in the earliest months of their courtship. He remembered glancing up from his papers, telling her he had perhaps another hour of work remaining, promising to join her shortly. He had not remembered, until this very moment in the carriage, that he never actually joined her that evening. The work had stretched, as it always did, and by the time he emerged from the study the fire had burned low, and Eleanor had already gone up to bed. He had not thought anything of it at the time. It had felt, in the moment, like an entirely unremarkable evening, one of thousands of ordinary evenings that made up the fabric of a long marriage. He wondered now how many other evenings had unfolded exactly the same way, small requests quietly set aside, promises made and then forgotten beneath the weight of more pressing matters, until Eleanor had simply stopped asking at all. That thought troubled him more than almost anything else Charles or Margaret had said. It was not the presence of conflict that had damaged his marriage, it was the absence of it. Eleanor had never shouted at him, never accused him of neglect, never once, as far as he could recall, raised her voice in frustration. She had simply grown quieter, year after year, and he had mistaken that quiet for contentment rather than recognizing it for what Margaret had called it, loneliness wearing the mask of peace. He arrived at a coaching inn as evening fell, and though he intended only to rest briefly before continuing the journey at first light, sleep proved difficult to find. He lay awake in the unfamiliar room, listening to the sounds of the inn settling around him, and found his thoughts drifting toward practical matters now, toward what he might actually say when he finally stood in front of Eleanor again. He had never been a man who struggled for words. In business matters, in negotiations with other landowners, in disputes that required careful diplomacy, he had always known exactly what to say and how to say it convincingly. But he understood, lying in the dark of that unfamiliar room, that none of those skills would serve him now. Eleanor did not need to be persuaded of anything. She needed, simply, to be heard. And Nathaniel was beginning to suspect that true listening required an entirely different set of skills than the ones he had spent his life perfecting. He thought of Charles's warning, "Do not arrive with arguments prepared." He thought of Margaret's warning, "Pretty words will not be enough." He thought of Dr. Hume's advice, "Listen more than you speak." Each warning pointed toward the same uncomfortable truth. Whatever he had been doing for the past 6 years, however well-intentioned, had not been enough, and simply trying harder at the same approach would not fix what had gone wrong. He needed to become a different kind of husband, not simply a more attentive version of the one he had already been. He rose before dawn, unable to sleep further, and stood at the window of his room, watching the sky slowly lighten over the rooftops of the small town. He thought of Eleanor waking in the cottage by the coast, wherever exactly it was, alone with her fears about her own heart, alone with whatever hurt had finally driven her to leave, rather than continue waiting for him to notice. He thought, too, of the ring in his coat pocket, and found himself taking it out to look at it in the pale early light. It was a simple band, nothing elaborate, chosen 6 years ago because Eleanor had told him she preferred simplicity to grandeur, a preference he remembered now with some surprise, since he could not recall many other moments where he had actually asked her what she preferred rather than simply deciding for the both of them. He resolved, standing there in the quiet of the early morning, that whatever happened when he found her, he would begin by asking rather than telling. He would ask what she needed, what she had been afraid to say, what 6 years of careful silence had cost her. He would ask, and then he would do the far more difficult work of actually listening to the answer, without immediately trying to fix it or explain it away. The carriage resumed its journey shortly after dawn, and the countryside slowly began to change around him, the flat inland fields giving way to gentler hills, and eventually the first hints of salt air drifting through the carriage window told him the coast was drawing near. He found himself growing more anxious with each passing mile, not the sharp anxiety of the previous morning when he had first discovered her absence, but something quieter and more persistent, the anxiety of a man approaching a conversation he knew mattered more than any he had ever had. He thought of the years ahead, if this went well. Years he wanted to spend differently than the 6 behind him. Years where Eleanor's quiet moments were met with genuine curiosity rather than comfortable assumption, where her preferences were sought rather than simply overridden by his own, where her health was managed not through distant protection but through shared vigilance, the two of them facing it together rather than her carrying it alone while he remained comfortably unaware. He thought too of the years ahead if this did not go well, If Eleanor had already decided that whatever chance their marriage once had was now spent beyond recovery, he forced that thought away, not because it was unreasonable, but because he understood that arriving with the fear of failure already settled in his chest would make failure more likely, not less. The carriage rounded a final bend in the road, and the sea came into view below, gray and vast beneath a pale morning sky. And somewhere along that coastline, in a small cottage that had once belonged to Eleanor's family, the woman he had spent 6 years failing to truly see was waiting. Perhaps for him, perhaps for nothing at all. Perhaps simply for the quiet she had been denied for so long inside the walls of his grand and empty house. He asked the driver how much further remained and was told perhaps another hour along the coastal road. He settled back against the seat, the ring still held tightly in his hand, and spent that final hour not rehearsing what he would say, but simply trying, for what felt like the first time in longer than he could remember, to imagine what the past year had actually felt like from Eleanor's side of their marriage. It was not a comfortable exercise. He suspected it was not meant to be. The cottage stood at the end of a narrow lane, weathered stone softened by years of salt wind, with a garden gone slightly wild around its edges, and a view of the sea stretching endlessly beyond a low wall at the bottom of the slope. Nathaniel told the driver to wait at the top of the lane, and walked the rest of the way alone, his boots crunching softly against the gravel path, his heart beating harder than it had in years. Smoke rose thin and steady from the chimney. She was here. He stood for a long moment at the small wooden gate, gathering himself, uncertain suddenly of how to begin. Every argument he might have made, every explanation he might have offered, seemed to dissolve the closer he came to the actual door behind which Eleanor was waiting. He remembered Charles's words, "Go to listen." He remembered Dr. Hume's words, "She has spent a great deal of time feeling unheard." He knocked. For a long moment there was no answer, and he wondered if perhaps he had guessed wrong, if this was not where she had gone after all. Then he heard footsteps, slow and careful, and the door opened, and Eleanor stood before him in a simple gray dress, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way he rarely saw at home. Her expression caught somewhere between surprise and a kind of resigned expectation, as though some part of her had known he would eventually come but had not been entirely certain when. "Nathaniel," she said quietly. "I found your note," he said. "I spoke with Lucy, and Charles, and your sister, and Dr. Hume." Something shifted in her face at the mention of the doctor's name. A flicker of fear quickly masked, and Nathaniel understood in that instant that she had not expected him to seek out that particular conversation, had perhaps hoped, even while leaving the note that pointed toward it, that he would stop somewhere short of the full truth. "You know then," she said softly, "about my heart." "I know," he said. "I know about the visits, and the diagnosis, and I know that you were afraid to tell me because you thought I would begin treating you like something fragile instead of like my wife." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she did not immediately let fall, and she stepped back from the doorway, not quite an invitation, but not a refusal either, and Nathaniel took it as permission to step inside. The cottage was small and simply furnished, a single sitting room with a fire already lit against the coastal chill, a worn armchair positioned near the window that looked out over the water. "May I sit?" he asked, and something about the question, so small and so unlike the confidence he usually carried into every room he entered, seemed to affect her deeply. She nodded, and they settled into chairs across from each other, not the wide formal distance of their dining table at home, but close enough that he could see the tiredness in her eyes, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for far too long alone. "I'm not here to bring you home," he said carefully, "not unless that is what you want. I'm here because I want to understand everything I missed, and because I want to know what you actually need, not what I have always assumed you needed." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, as though searching his face for evidence that these were not simply more pretty words, the kind Margaret had warned him would not be enough. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed, cautiously, to find some trace of it, because she finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I did not leave because I stopped loving you," she said. "I left because I stopped believing you would ever truly see me, and I could not carry that feeling for the rest of my life, especially not now, not with everything Dr. Hume has told me about my heart." "Tell me," he said. "Please, I want to hear all of it, even the parts that are difficult to say." She was quiet for a long moment, gathering herself, and then she began to speak, slowly at first, and then with growing steadiness, as though 6 years of unspoken words were finally finding their way out. She told him about the fatigue that had first sent her to Dr. Hume, and the fear she had felt sitting alone in his office receiving the diagnosis, and the long carriage ride home afterward where she had rehearsed, over and over, how she might tell her husband the news, only to arrive home and find him occupied with estate matters, and to lose her courage in the face of his familiar, distant kindness. She told him about the evenings she had asked him to sit with her, and the quiet disappointment each time those evenings dissolved into hours he spent alone in his study instead. She told him she had never blamed him for those choices individually, understanding the demands of managing a large estate, but that the accumulated weight of them, evening after evening, had slowly convinced her that she came second to everything else in his life, and that if she told him about her heart, he would simply add her condition to the long list of things he managed efficiently and from a careful distance, rather than something he faced beside her. "I did not want to become another item in your ledger," she said, her voice breaking slightly on the word. "I wanted to be your wife, not a problem to be solved, not a fragile thing to be protected, but a person you actually wanted to sit with, to talk to know." Nathaniel felt each word land with the full weight of 6 years of quiet failure, and he did not try to defend himself, did not offer explanations about the genuine demands of the estate or the genuine intentions behind his choices. He understood now that explanations were not what she needed. She needed him to simply hear it, all of it, without flinching away or rushing to make himself feel better about what he had done. "You're right," he said finally, when she had fallen silent, tears now falling freely down her face. "About all of it. I have spent 6 years believing that providing for you and remaining steady and never causing you distress was the same thing as loving you well. I understand now that it was not enough. It was not even close to enough." Eleanor wiped at her eyes, watching him carefully, and Nathaniel found himself continuing, the words coming slower now, more carefully chosen, because he understood this was not a moment for eloquence but for honesty. "I don't know if I can promise to become a completely different man overnight," he said. "I have spent my whole life learning to manage things at a distance, estates and accounts and difficult conversations with other men who wanted something from me. I don't fully know how to simply sit with someone and listen without trying to solve whatever is troubling them. But I want to learn. I want to learn it with you, if you'll let me try, and I want to start today, right now, in this room, by asking you what you actually need from me, rather than assuming I already know." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression he could not fully read, somewhere between hope and lingering caution, the look of a person who has been disappointed too many times to trust easily, even when the words being offered sound exactly right. "I need you to ask me how I am," she said finally, "and mean it, not the polite version, at breakfast, where you already expect the answer to be fine. I need you to actually wait for the real answer, even when it is complicated, even when it takes longer than a moment to give." "I can do that," he said. "I need you to sit with me sometimes," she continued, her voice growing steadier, more certain, as though the practice of saying these things aloud was itself giving her courage. "Not because you have finished your work for the day and have nothing better to do, but because you have chosen it over the work, even when the work is not finished." "I understand," he said. "And I need you to let me be part of decisions," she said. "Not simply informed of them after you have already decided. I am not asking to control everything. I am asking to matter in the choices that shape our life together." Nathaniel nodded slowly, absorbing each request, understanding that these were not extravagant demands, not unreasonable expectations from a wife who wanted too much. They were, in fact, remarkably small things, the ordinary texture of a marriage built on genuine partnership rather than comfortable arrangement. He felt something close to shame that these small things had never been present in the first place, that Eleanor had needed to leave her own home and travel to a quiet cottage by the sea before she felt safe enough to name them aloud. "I will do all of that," he said. "Not perfectly, not immediately, but I will try, every day, and I will keep trying even on the days I fail, because I understand now what failing to try has already cost us both." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and then, slowly, something in her posture began to soften, the careful guardedness she had carried since opening the door easing, just slightly, into something closer to the woman he remembered from the early years of their marriage, before the quiet distance had settled between them. "I'm frightened," she admitted quietly, "about my heart, and about trusting you with all of it, when I have spent so long protecting myself by keeping parts of myself hidden away." "I know," he said. "I'm frightened too, but I would rather be frightened together than steady and alone. I understand now that the second one is not actually peace. It only looks like peace from a distance." Outside, the sea continued its steady rhythm against the shore, and the fire crackled quietly in the hearth, and for the first time in longer than either of them could clearly remember, Nathaniel and Eleanor sat together in a comfortable silence, not the empty silence of two people with nothing left to say, but the fuller silence of two people who had finally said enough of the truth to simply rest in each other's presence for a while. They remained at the cottage for 3 more days, and Nathaniel found himself, for the first time in years, entirely without the familiar structure of estate business to fill his hours. There were no ledgers here, no letters demanding responses, no meetings with tenants or discussions with Charles about crop yields and rents. There was only the small stone cottage, the sound of the sea, and Eleanor, and Nathaniel discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not miss the absence of his usual work nearly as much as he had expected to. On the first morning, he woke before her and found himself unsure what to do with the quiet hours before she rose. His old habit would have been to seek out correspondence, to occupy himself productively while waiting for the day to properly begin. Instead, he walked down to the small kitchen and attempted, clumsily and without much success, to prepare breakfast, wanting Eleanor to wake to something he had made with his own hands rather than something arranged and delivered by staff. The result was imperfect, the eggs slightly overcooked, the tea steeped too long, but when Eleanor came down and found him standing awkwardly over the small stove, an expression crossed her face that he had not seen directed at him in a very long time, something between amusement and genuine tenderness. "You've never cooked anything in your life," she said, half laughing. "I thought it was time to start," he said, "even if I'm not very good at it yet." They sat together at the small table by the window, eating the imperfect breakfast, and Eleanor asked him, quietly, why he had decided to try something so unfamiliar. He considered the question seriously before answering. "Because I wanted you to know I was willing to be bad at something new," he said. "For a long time I think I only ever let you see the parts of me that were already competent, already steady, already sure of themselves. I wanted you to see this part too. The part that doesn't know what it's doing yet." Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand, the first time she had touched him since he arrived at the cottage, and Nathaniel felt something in his chest ease that had been tight since the moment he first saw the empty chair at their breakfast table days earlier. Over the following days, they talked in a way they had not talked in years, not the careful, pleasant exchanges of dinner conversation, but long, unhurried conversations that wandered wherever they needed to go. Eleanor told him about her childhood summers at the cottage, about her father's decline in fortune and the grief of watching a beloved place slip slowly out of her family's hands, about the fear she still carried, quietly, most days, of her own heart failing her without warning. Nathaniel listened, really listened, resisting every instinct to offer solutions or reassurances before she had finished speaking, and found that the effort of simply staying present, without trying to fix anything, was harder than he had expected and also, strangely, more rewarding than any negotiation he had ever successfully closed in his years of managing the estate. He told her things too, things he had never fully articulated even to himself, about the pressure he had felt since inheriting his title young, about the belief instilled in him since boyhood that a duke's worth was measured entirely by his steadiness, his ability to remain unshaken regardless of what stirred beneath the surface. He told her that somewhere along the way, he had confused steadiness with distance, had believed that showing too much feeling, even to his own wife, was a kind of weakness unbecoming of his position. "I think I was afraid," he admitted one evening, as they sat together by the fire, "that if I let myself feel things too openly, I would somehow become less capable of managing everything that depended on me, the estate, the tenants, you. I thought steadiness required a kind of distance from my own heart. And now?" Eleanor asked softly. "Now I think that distance cost me the very things I was trying to protect," he said. "It nearly cost me you." On the third evening, as the light faded gold and pink over the water, Eleanor asked him the question that would come to define, more than any other moment of that week, the shape of the years that followed. "If you could change one thing," she said, "just one, what would you do differently, starting from today?" Nathaniel thought carefully before answering, understanding that this was not a moment for a grand, sweeping promise, the kind of easy declaration that sounds impressive but ultimately means very little. He thought of everything Lucy and Charles and Margaret and Dr. Hume had told him, everything Eleanor herself had said in that first difficult conversation at the cottage door, and he searched for something specific, something small enough to actually keep. "I would ask you, every single evening, without fail, to tell me one true thing about your day," he said finally. "Not the polite version, the real one, even if it's difficult, even if it takes longer than either of us expects. And I would put down whatever I'm working on to actually listen, every time, without exception." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, considering the specificity of the promise. and Nathaniel could see her weighing it against 6 years of grander but ultimately empty gestures, wondering whether this smaller, more concrete commitment might actually prove more durable than any of the larger ones might have been. "That's a good place to start," she said finally, and something in her voice told him she believed, cautiously but genuinely, that he meant it. That night, before they retired, Nathaniel took the ring from his coat pocket, where it had remained since the morning he found it on the breakfast table, and held it out to her, not as a demand or an expectation, but as an offering. "I'm not asking you to put this back on because you feel obligated to," he said. "I'm asking because I want you to choose it, the way I intend to choose you, every day, not because it's expected of me but because I actually want to." Eleanor looked at the ring for a long moment, and then at him, and something in her expression told him she was searching not for reasons to say yes, but for any remaining reasons to say no, testing whether the fear that had driven her from her own home days earlier had truly been addressed or merely soothed for the length of one difficult conversation. Finally, slowly, she took the ring from his palm and slid it back onto her own finger, her hand steady in a way that told him this was not a decision made from relief or obligation, but a genuine choice, made with clear eyes and full understanding of everything that had brought them to this small cottage by the sea. "I'm choosing this," she said quietly, "not because you found me, because of what you did once you did." They returned home 4 days after Nathaniel first found the empty chair at the breakfast table, and the house that had felt unbearably large and silent on the morning of her departure felt, upon their return, different somehow, not because anything about its physical structure had changed, but because both of them walked through its halls now with a shared understanding of what had nearly been lost within them. Lucy greeted them at the door with quiet relief, and Charles, when he saw them together, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile before returning to his usual reserved manner. Margaret arrived within the week, studying Nathaniel with the sharp, assessing look of a woman determined to verify for herself that real change had actually taken root, and after several days of careful observation, she seemed, cautiously, to believe it had. The change was not sudden or dramatic in the way stories sometimes suggest such changes should be. There was no single grand gesture that fixed 6 years of quiet distance in an instant. Instead, it was built slowly, evening by evening, through small and deliberate choices repeated consistently enough that they gradually became habit rather than effort. Nathaniel began closing his study earlier each evening, not because the work diminished, but because he decided, consciously, every single day, that Eleanor's company mattered more than one additional hour of ledgers that could easily wait until morning. He asked her, each evening without fail, to tell him one true thing about her day, and slowly, as the weeks passed, Eleanor's answers grew longer, more honest, more willing to include the difficult and complicated feelings she had once believed she needed to hide. He learned, gradually, to sit beside her without needing to fill every silence with words, to simply be present in a room with her, reading or resting or watching the fire, without the persistent pull toward productivity that had once governed nearly every hour of his day. He learned, too, to ask about her heart, not with the anxious, hovering concern she had feared, but with the same steady, ordinary curiosity he brought to any other part of their shared life, treating her condition as something they faced together, rather than something he managed from a careful and protective distance. Eleanor, for her part, found herself slowly trusting the change, watching it prove itself not through any single dramatic moment, but through the accumulated weight of many small, ordinary evenings, each one a little different from the 6 years that had come before, each one a small act of choosing each other again. Winter came hard that year, the coldest in a decade according to the older tenants who had seen many winters pass over the estate, and it was during the deepest part of that cold, nearly 8 months after the morning Nathaniel found the ring on the breakfast table, that the fragile progress they had built together faced its first true test. Eleanor collapsed in the garden one gray afternoon, and Lucy found her there, pale and struggling for breath among the frost-covered rose bushes she had been tending despite the cold, against Dr. Hume's careful instructions about avoiding excessive strain. By the time Nathaniel reached her, summoned from the study by a servant's frantic knocking, Eleanor had already been carried inside and laid upon the couch in the sitting room, her face ashen, her breathing shallow and uneven. He knelt beside her, taking her hand, and felt a fear unlike anything he had experienced in his life, sharper and more consuming than the fear he had felt on the morning she left, because this fear carried with it the possibility that he might lose her, not to distance or misunderstanding, but to something far more final, and far less within his power to fix through patience and changed behavior alone. Dr. Hume arrived within the hour, summoned by a rider sent at full gallop, and worked over her with careful, practiced hands, while Nathaniel stood nearby, forcing himself to remain calm for her sake, even as every instinct in him screamed toward panic. When the doctor finally straightened and turned to face him, his expression was serious but not without hope. "Her heart is under significant strain," he said, "but she is stable for now. She needs complete rest, and she needs it for a considerable time, longer perhaps than she will want to accept." Nathaniel returned to Eleanor's side once the doctor had finished, and found her eyes open, watching him with an expression of quiet apology that struck him more painfully than any accusation could have. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I wasn't supposed to be out in the cold like that. I just wanted the garden to look right before the frost ruined everything." "You don't need to apologize to me," he said, taking her hand again, holding it carefully as though it might break. "I'm not angry. I'm frightened, and I'm here, and I am not going anywhere." Over the following weeks, as Eleanor slowly recovered under strict instructions to rest, Nathaniel found himself facing a version of the test Charles had warned him about all those months ago at the coast, though he had not fully understood, at the time, exactly what shape that test would eventually take. It would have been easy, in the aftermath of her collapse, to slide back into the very pattern Eleanor had feared most, treating her as something fragile to be managed from a careful distance, wrapping her in anxious, hovering protection that stripped away her sense of being a full and capable partner in her own life. He caught himself, more than once, on the verge of exactly that instinct, moving to make every decision for her, insisting she remain entirely passive, while he and the household staff managed everything around her. Each time, he forced himself to stop, to remember the words she had spoken to him at the cottage door, to ask rather than assume, to include her in decisions about her own care rather than simply deciding on her behalf out of fear. "Do you want tea?" he would ask, instead of simply bringing it. "Would you rather rest in the sitting room or your own chambers today? Is there anything you'd like to talk about, or would you prefer quiet company instead?" The questions were small, almost trivial on their surface, but Eleanor noticed each one, and slowly, as the weeks of recovery passed, she began to trust that this crisis, unlike so many quiet moments in the years before it, would not become the excuse that finally pushed him back into old patterns of managing, rather than truly partnering with her. By early spring, she had recovered enough to walk in the garden again, carefully and with Dr. Hume's cautious approval, and Nathaniel walked beside her each afternoon, not hovering with anxious concern but simply present, matching her slower pace, talking with her about small and ordinary things, the roses that had survived the frost, letters from Margaret, the tenants' plans for the coming planting season. One afternoon, as they sat together on the low stone bench that overlooked the garden, Eleanor turned to him with an expression he had come to recognize over the past months, thoughtful and searching, the look she wore when she was about to say something that mattered. "I used to think love meant never being afraid," she said, "that if I truly trusted you, I would never feel frightened about what might happen between us, or about my own heart, or about anything at all. And now," he asked. "Now I think love isn't the absence of fear," she said. "I think it's choosing to stay close to someone even while the fear is still there. You were frightened that day I collapsed in the garden. I could see it in your face. But you stayed close instead of pulling away, and you asked me questions instead of deciding everything for me. That's different from before. That's the thing I couldn't have imagined from you a year ago." Nathaniel took her hand, the same simple gold ring still resting on her finger, worn now with the particular familiarity of a year spent choosing each other deliberately, day after day, rather than simply existing beside each other out of habit and obligation. "I think I understand now what Lucy meant, that first morning," he said. "About love not being the same thing as being seen. I loved you the whole time, even during the years I failed you. But loving someone and actually seeing them, actually staying present enough to notice what they need, those are different things, and I spent 6 years believing they were the same." Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the quiet spring afternoon, the garden slowly coming back to life around them after the hardest winter either of them could remember, and Nathaniel thought, watching the first green shoots pushing up through the softening earth, that perhaps this was what real partnership actually looked like, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of two people willing to face difficulty honestly, together, refusing to let distance settle back into the space between them ever again. Years later, long after that difficult winter had faded into memory, visitors to the Ashworth estate would sometimes remark on the particular warmth between the Duke and Duchess, a quality of attention that seemed unusual among couples of their standing. where marriages were so often built on convenient arrangement rather than genuine closeness. Few of them ever learned the full story behind that warmth, the empty chair at a breakfast table, the note that asks 6 words worth of impossible questions, the long journey to a small cottage by the sea where a marriage had nearly ended and instead, through difficult and deliberate effort, finally began. Eleanor kept the note, tucked away in a small drawer in her writing desk, and took it out occasionally over the years that followed, not out of sadness but as a quiet reminder of the morning everything had changed. 6 words, she would think, each time she read them again. 6 words that had asked her husband to become, finally, the kind of man capable of finding his own way to the truth, rather than waiting to be told it and forgetting it again by evening. And each time she read them, she found Nathaniel had kept his promise, not perfectly. No marriage sustains itself through perfection, but consistently, evening after evening, year after year, in all the small and ordinary ways that had once been entirely absent from their life together, and that now formed the quiet, steady foundation of everything that came after.